Chapter 14, Part 4 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home by Emily Post. Chapter 14, Part 4, Formal Dinners. Place cards. The place cards are usually about 1.5 inches high by 2 inches long, sometimes slightly larger. People of old family have their crest embossed in plain white; occasionally an elderly hostess, following a lifelong custom, has her husband's crest stamped in gold. Nothing other than a crest must ever be engraved on a place card, and usually they are plain, even in the houses of old families. Years ago hand-painted place cards are said to have been in fashion, but excepting on such occasions as Christmas or a birthday dinner, they are never seen in private houses today. Menu cards. Small standing porcelain slates, on which the menu is written, are seen on occasional dinner tables. Most often there is only one, which is placed in front of the host, but sometimes there is one between every 2 guests. Seating the table. As has already been observed, the most practical way to seat the table is to write the names on individual cards first, and then place them as though playing solitaire, the guest of honor on the host's right, the second lady in rank on his left, the most distinguished or oldest gentleman on the right of the hostess, and all the other guests filled in between. Who is the guest of honor? The guest of honor is the oldest lady present, or a stranger whom you wish, for some reason, to honor. A bride at her first dinner in your house after her return from her honeymoon takes, if you choose to have her, precedence over older people. Or if a younger woman has been long away, she, in this instance of welcoming her home, takes precedence over her elders. The guest of honor is always led into dinner by the host, and placed on his right. The second in importance sits on his left, and is taken into dinner by the gentleman on whose right she sits. The hostess is always the last to go in the dining room at a formal dinner. Envelopes for the gentleman. In an envelope addressed to each gentleman is put a card, on which is written the name of the lady he is to take down to dinner. This card just fits in the envelope, which is 1 inch or slightly less high, and about 2 inches long. When the envelopes are addressed and filled, they are arranged in 2 neat rows on a silver tray, and put in the front hall. The tray is presented to each gentleman just before he goes into the drawing-room, on his arrival. The table diagram. A frame made of leather, round or rectangular, with small openings at regular intervals around the edge, in which names written on cards can be slipped, shows the seating of the table at a glance. In a frame holding 24 cards, 12 guests would be indicated by leaving every other card place blank, or for 8, only 1 in 3 is filled. This diagram is shown to each gentleman upon his arrival, so that he can see who is coming for dinner and where he himself is placed. At a dinner of 10 or less, this diagram is especially convenient, as envelopes are only used at formal dinners of 12 and over. When the hostess sits at the side. When the number of guests is a multiple of 4, the host and hostess never sit opposite each other. It would bring 2 ladies and 2 gentlemen together if they did. At a table which seats 2 together at each end, the fact that the host is opposite a gentleman and the hostess opposite a lady is not noticeable, nor is it ever noticeable at a round table. But at a narrow table, which has room for only 1 at the end, the hostess invariably sits in the next seat to that which is properly her own, putting in her place a gentleman at the end. The host usually keeps his seat rather than the hostess, because the seat of honor is on his right, and in the etiquette governing dinners, the host and not the hostess is the more important personage. When there are only 4, they keep their own places; otherwise the host and hostess would sit next to each other. At a dinner of 8, 12, 16, 20, etc., the host keeps his place, but at a supper for 8 or 12, the hostess keeps her place, and the host moves a place to the right or left, because the hostess at supper pours coffee or chocolate. And although the host keeps his seat at a formal dinner in honor of the lady he takes in, at a little dinner of 8, Where there is no guest of honor, the host does not necessarily keep his seat at the expense of his wife, unless he carves, in which case he must have the end place, just as at supper she has the end place in order to pour. Sidewalk, hall, and dressing rooms. One can be pretty sure, on seeing a red velvet carpet spread down the steps of a house, or up, since there are so many sunken American basement entrances, that there are people for dinner. The carpet is kept rolled, or turned under near the foot or top of the steps, until a few minutes before the dinner hour, when it is spread across the width of the pavement by the chauffeur, or whoever is on duty on the sidewalk. Very big or formal dinners often have an awning, especially at a house where there is much entertaining, and which has an awning of its own. But at an ordinary house, for a dinner of 12 or so, the man on the pavement must, if it is raining, shelter each arriving guest under his coachman's umbrella from carriage to door. If it does not rain, he merely opens the doors of vehicles. Checks are never given at dinners, no matter how big. Every motor is called by address at the end of the evening. The worldly car is not shouted for as worldly, but XOX Fifth Avenue. The typical coachman of another day used to tell you carriages are ordered for 10:15. Carriages were nearly always ordered for that hour, though with slow and long dinners no one ever actually left until the horses had exercised for at least an hour. But the chauffeur of to-day opens the door in silence, unless there is to be a concert or amateur theatricals, when he, like the coachman, says, "Motors are ordered for 12 o'clock," or whatever hour he is told to say. In this day of telephone and indefinite bridge games, many people prefer to have their cars telephoned for when they are ready to go home. Those who do not play bridge leave an 8 o'clock dinner about 10:30, or at least order their cars for that hour. In all modern houses of size there are 2 rooms on the entrance floor, built sometimes as dressing rooms and nothing else, but more often they are small reception rooms, each with a lavatory off of it. In the one given to the ladies there is always a dressing table with toilet appointments on it, and the lady's maid should be on duty to give whatever service may be required. When there is no dressing room on the ground floor, the back of the hall is arranged with coat hangers and an improved dressing table for the ladies, since modern people, in New York at least, never go upstairs to a bedroom if they can help it. In fact, 9 ladies out of 10 drop their evening cloaks at the front door, handing them to the servant on duty, and go at once without more ado to the drawing-room. A lady arriving in her own closed car can't be very much blown about, in a completely air-tight compartment, and within 2 or 3 minutes of time. Gentlemen also leave their hats and coats in the front part of the hall. A servant presents to each a tray of envelopes, and if there is one, the table diagram. Envelopes are not really necessary when there is a table diagram, since every gentleman knows that he takes in the lady placed on his right. But at very big dinners in New York or Washington, where many people are sure to be strangers to one another, an absent-minded gentleman might better, perhaps, have his partner's name safely in his pocket. Announcing guests. A gentleman always falls behind his wife in entering the drawing-room. If the butler knows the guests, he merely announces the wife's name first and then the husband's. If he does not know them by sight, he asks whichever is nearest to him, "What name, please?" and whichever one is asked answers, "Mr. and Mrs. Lake." The butler then precedes the guests a few steps into the room where the hostess is stationed, and, standing aside, says in a low tone but very distinctly, "Mrs. Lake." A pause, and then "Mr. Lake." Married people are usually announced separately, as above, but occasionally people have their guests announced, "Mr. and Mrs. Blank." Announcing persons of rank. All men of high executive rank are not alone announced first, but take precedence of their wives in entering the room. The President of the United States is announced simply, "The President and Mrs. Harding." His title needs no qualifying appendage, since he and he solely is the President. He enters first and alone, of course, and then Mrs. Harding follows. The same form precisely is used for the Vice President and Mrs. Coolidge. A governor is sometimes, in courtesy, called Excellency, but the correct announcement would be "the Governor of New Jersey and Mrs. Edwards." He enters the room and Mrs. Edwards follows. The Mayor and Mrs. Thompson observe the same etiquette, or in a city other than his own he would be announced the Mayor of Chicago and Mrs. Thompson. Other announcements are the Chief Justice and Mrs. Taft, the Secretary of State and Mrs. Hughes, Senator and Mrs. Washington, but in this case the latter enters the room first, because his office is not executive. According to diplomatic etiquette, an ambassador and his wife should be announced. Their Excellencies the Ambassador and Ambassadress of Great Britain. The ambassador enters the room first. A minister plenipotentiary is announced the Minister of Sweden. He enters a moment later, and Mrs. Ogren follows. But a first secretary and his wife are announced, if they have a title of their own, Count and Countess European, or Mr. and Mrs. American. The president, the vice president, the governor of a state, the mayor of a city, the ambassador of a foreign power, in other words all executives, take precedence over their wives, and enter rooms and vehicles first, but senators, representatives, secretaries of legations, and all other officials who are not executive, allow their wives to precede them, just as they would if they were private individuals. Foreigners who have hereditary titles are announced by them, the Duke and Duchess of Over There, the Marquis and Marchioness of Land's End, or Sir Edward and Lady Blank, etc. Titles are invariably translated into English. Count and Countess Lorraine, not Monsieur le Comte et Madame la Comtesse Lorraine. How a hostess receives at a formal dinner. On all occasions of formality, at a dinner as well as at a ball, the hostess stands near the door of her drawing-room, and as guests are announced she greets them with a smile and a handshake, and says something pleasant to each. What she says is nothing very important. Charm of expression and of manner can often wordlessly express a far more gracious welcome than the most elaborate phrases, which, as a matter of fact, should be studiously avoided. Unless a woman's loveliness springs from generosity of heart and sympathy, her manners, no matter how perfectly practised, are nothing but cosmetics applied to hide a want of inner beauty, precisely as rouge and powder are applied, in the hope of hiding the lack of a beautiful skin. One device is about as successful as the other, quite pleasing unless brought into comparison with the real. Mrs. Oldname, for instance, usually welcomes you with some such sentences as, "I am very glad to see you," or "I am so glad you could come," or if it is raining she very likely tells you that you were very unselfish to come out in the storm. But no matter what she says, or whether anything at all, she takes your hand with a firm pressure, and her smile is really a smile of welcome, not a mechanical exercise of the facial muscles. She gives you always, even if only for the moment, her complete attention, and you go into her drawing-room with a distinct feeling that you are under the roof, not of a mere acquaintance, but of a friend. Mr. Oldname, who stands never very far from his wife, always comes forward, and, grasping your hand, accentuates his wife more subtle, but no less vivid welcome. And either you join a friend standing near, or he presents you, if you are a man, to a lady, or if you are a lady he presents a man to you. Some hostesses, especially those of the lion hunting and the new to best society variety, are much given to explanations, and love to say, "Mrs. Jones, I want you to meet Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith is the author of Dragged from the Depths, a most enlightening work of psychic insight," or to a good-looking woman, "I am putting you next to the Assyrian ambassador. I want him to carry back a flattering impression of American women." But people of good breeding do not over-exploit their distinguished guests with embarrassing hyperbole, or make personal remarks. Both are in the worst possible taste. Do not understand by this that explanations cannot be made. It is only that they must not be embarrassingly made to their faces. Nor must a specialist's subject be forced upon him, like a pair of manacles, by any exploiting hostess who has captured him. Mrs. Oldname might, perhaps, in order to assist conversation for an interesting but reticent person, tell a lady just before going in to dinner, "Mr. Traveller, who is sitting next to you at the table, has just come back from 2 years alone with the cannibals." This is not to exploit her travelled lion, but to give his neighbour a starting point for conversation at table. and although personal remarks are never good form, it would be permissible for an older lady, in welcoming a very young one, especially a debutante or a bride, to say, "How lovely you look, Mary dear, and what an adorable dress you have on!" But to say to an older lady, "That is a very handsome string of pearls you are wearing," would be objectionable. The duty of the host. The host stands fairly near his wife, so that if any guest seems to be unknown to all the others, he can present him to some one. At formal dinners introductions are never general, and people do not, as a rule, speak to strangers, except those next to them at table, or in the drawing room after dinner. The host therefore makes a few introductions if necessary. Before dinner, since the hostess is standing, and no gentleman may therefore sit down, and as it is awkward for a lady who is sitting to talk with a gentleman who is standing, the ladies usually also stand until dinner is announced. When dinner is announced, it is the duty of the butler to count heads so that he may know when the company has arrived. As soon as he has announced the last person, he notifies the cook. The cook being ready, the butler, having glanced into the dining room to see that the windows have been closed and the candles on the table lighted, enters the drawing room, approaches the hostess, bows, and says quietly, "Dinner is served." The host offers his arm to the lady of honor, and leads the way to the dining room. All the other gentlemen offer their arms to the ladies appointed to them, and follow the host in an orderly procession, two and two. The only order of precedent is that the host and his partner lead, while the hostess and her partner come last. At all formal dinners, place cards being on the table, the hostess does not direct people where to sit. If there was no table diagram in the hall, the butler, standing just within the dining room door, tells each gentleman as he approaches, right or left. R or L is occasionally written on the lady's name card in the envelopes given to the gentleman. Or if it is such a big dinner that there are many separate tables, the tables are numbered with standing placards, as at a public dinner, and the table number written on each lady's name card. The manners of a hostess. First of all, a hostess must show each of her guests equal and impartial attention. Although engrossed in the person she is talking to, she must be able to notice anything amiss that may occur. The more competent her servants, the less she need be aware of details herself, but the hostess giving a formal dinner with uncertain dining room efficiency has a far from smooth path before her. No matter what happens, if all the china in the pantry falls with a crash, she must not appear to have heard it. No matter what goes wrong, she must cover it as best she may, and at the same time cover the fact that she is covering it. To give hectic directions merely accentuates the awkwardness. If a dish appears that is unpresentable, she, as quietly as possible, orders the next one to be brought in. If a guest knocks over a glass and breaks it, even though the glass be a piece of genuine Stiegel, her only concern must seemingly be that her guest's place has been made uncomfortable. She says, "I am so sorry, but I will have it fixed at once." The broken glass is nothing, and she has a fresh glass brought, even though it doesn't match, and dismisses all thought of the matter. Both the host and hostess must keep the conversation going, if it lags, but this is not as definitely their duty at a formal as at an informal dinner. It is at the small dinner that the skilful hostess has need of what Thackeray calls the showman quality. She brings each guest forward in turn to the center of the stage. In a lull in the conversation she says beguilingly to a clever but shy man, "John, what was that story you told me?" And then she repeats briefly an introduction to a topic in which John particularly shines. Or, later on, she begins a narrative and breaks off suddenly, turning to someone else, "You tell them." These examples are rather bald, and over-emphasize the method in order to make it clear. Practice in the knowledge of human nature, or of the particular temperament with which she is trying to deal, can alone tell her when she may lead or provoke this or that one to being at his best, to his own satisfaction as well as that of the others who may be present. Her own character and sympathy are the only real showman assets, since no one shows to advantage except in a congenial environment. The late guest. A polite hostess waits 20 minutes after the dinner hour, and then orders dinner served. To wait more than 20 minutes, or actually 15 after those who took the allowable 5 minutes grace, would be showing lack of consideration to many for the sake of one. When the late guest finally enters the dining room, the hostess rises, shakes hands with her, but does not leave her place at table. She doesn't rise for a gentleman. It is the guest who must go up to the hostess and apologize for being late. The hostess must never take the guest to task, but should say something polite and conciliatory, such as, "I was sure you would not want us to wait dinner." The newcomer is usually served with dinner from the beginning, unless she is considerate enough to say to the butler, "Just let me begin with this course." Old Mrs. Toplofty's manners to late guests are an exception. On the last stroke of 8 o'clock in winter, and half after 8 in Newport, dinner is announced. She waits for no one. Furthermore, a guest arriving after a course has been served does not have to protest against disarranging the order of dinner, since the rule of the house is that a course which has passed a chair is not to be returned. A guest missing his turn misses that course. The result is that everyone dining with Mrs. Toplofty arrives on the stroke of the dinner hour, which is also rather necessary, as she is one of those who like the service to be rushed through at top speed, and any one arriving half an hour late would find dinner over. It would be excellent discipline if there were more hostesses like her, but no young woman should be so autocratic, and few older ones care or dare to be. Nothing shows selfish want of consideration more than being habitually late for dinner. Not only are others, who were themselves considerate, kept waiting, but dinner is dried and ruined for every one else through the fault of the tardy one. And though expert cooks know how to keep food from becoming uneatable, no food can be so good as at the moment for which it is prepared, and the habitually late guest should be made to realize how unfairly she is meeting her host's generosity, by destroying for every one the hospitality which she was invited to share. On the other hand, before a formal dinner, it is the duty of the hostess to be dressed and in her drawing-room 15 or 10 minutes at least before the hour set for dinner. For a very informal dinner it is not important to be ready ahead of time, but even then a late hostess is an inconsiderate one. End of chapter 14, part 4.